bit. 3, 2, 1. Panel. Language has always been an imposition on people. It is either done by the majority onto the minority communities of the country. This is to say that people who live in Dhaka of Bangladesh imposing their language on people who live in the hill tracts, or it is done through processes like colonialism, or in the modern world through economic opportunities and structures that lock people out of speaking their own language. We tell you, in a world where language is imposed on people and we can't stop that, the best way in which we can make this acceptable and palatable is to increase the accessibility to this language that people need to speak in order for them to have a meaningful life. We from Side Proposition say that it is better to teach descriptive language because it's much more accessible, it allows assimilation, and it allows much greater artistic expression, and it allows for better communication, which is the core purpose of language, and therefore we win this debate. So understand this. The status quo in many worlds, like in this world where most teaching of language is done through prescriptive means, minority languages cease to exist. Because I've already explained to you why economic structures significantly disincentivize people from speaking minority languages. There's a lack of state support for these languages. There are no schools that teach these languages properly because they don't have economic utility and they don't get jobs. Therefore, the alternative in the status quo is to only teach English or the majority language in a way that is defined by the elites as a monolithic way of teaching that language. The comparative that we give you from Side Opening Government is that we understand that this languages, like minority languages, will probably get lost in some way. But on our side, we can preserve some sort of that language through assimilating to a majority language by forms such as Spanglish or Banglish in Bangla, where we can mix Bangla and English to a lot of ways to have this survival of that language ensured. But why is this better for the minorities? Because this allows them to teach their own language as a part of the curriculum and allows them to have political will to preserve some aspects of their language better, where the comparative is to remove that language altogether. Furthermore, this improves the ability of the teachers of that locality to properly teach the language, because most of these teachers are not equipped to understand proper Oxford class grammar, but they are able to comprehend the basics of English, and if they can express it through their own words, if they can bring their own experiences and bring their own culture into the language and create sort of a synthetic language, that teaching becomes much more easier to compart to the students, and the students can receive that teaching much better. So not only does it make their language last to a certain degree, it also makes the process of teaching easier to these people. But understand why prescriptive teaching is bad, because it creates barriers to entry, because there are rules and correctness that are hard to attain for non-native speaker, because you say that there is only one monolithic interpretation of language and that interpretation is justified only, and no other interpretation can exist. Prescriptive policies allow institutions like British Council to institutionalize language, to create a rigid hierarchy where it sets bars like IELTS and TOEFL that each and every international student has to pass for them to enter into a country. This exploits the poor all over the world who are less able to understand the language in a way that it has to follow all of these rules that are hard to comprehend if you're a non-native speaker. These tests are designed to make them fail. These tests are designed in a way that they have to try and try again to have a chance of succeeding, whether to pay time and time again to these councils, to these institutions who are gatekeepers of language. Why is this bad? Because understand that language is meant to express self. Prescriptions on their side police expression because there's only one way of expression. The genesis of language is the need for communication, and most communication in our world is informal. So if communication at its core is informal to a large extent, why must the vehicle of communication be dogmatic to an extent that it excludes people? They can't say that, oh, this will bastardize minority language, or this will dilute the importance of minority languages, because understand that language is dynamic, right? It will change, it will get destroyed, it will get reborn to a lot of extent, but the preservation of some aspects of that language allows people to relate much more to the things that they're learning. The counterfactual in onto the fluidity of literature and fluidity of expression and why that's important. Understand this, like Rabindranath Tagore won the Nobel Prize in 1913 by writing a book called Gitanjali. That was written in Bangla and was translated to English. Only he could do it because he had education from British universities and he was born to a privileged zamindar family. But no other author could ever do that because the rules were so strict back then that prevented them from translating their works properly because it didn't like suffice or it wasn't acceptable to the dogmatic standards that were set. Yes, I'll take closing if they have any.
Even if you change how minorities learn language, you don't change how the majority perceive language. So the harmonies talk about are still parallel in this round.
Understand this. This is a comparative, right? So if I speak poor English in a world where there's one monolithic standard of speaking English, I'm much more likely to be ostracized than if I speak poor English in a world where there are multiple interpretations of what English can be. So on the comparative, you're much more likely to be accepted in a greater society where there are multiple interpretations of what English could look like. Now, on the idea of fluidity of literature, right? On their side, they only allow privileged people from privileged background to express their ideas properly because your ideas become less important than the way in which you express your ideas. Because if you don't express it in the English form that comes from like universities like Oxford and Cambridge, your ideas don't really have value because they don't really pass the metric of being English enough to the standards of like certain dictionaries and certain institutions. That discourages people from using their interpretations, from using their lived experience. Because there are a lot of works that don't really exist in English. You can't express a lot of things in English that you can if you could just synthesize two languages together and create a new meaning that otherwise would not exist. These things are necessary because English cannot define the lived experiences of a lot of people. But if you could synthesize, if you could bring your own words into the language and create new meaning for yourself, then it becomes a much greater avenue for you to express yourself. On their side, they have an entrenched hierarchy where white privilege benefits, we increase access for people, allow expression in many forms. We are extremely proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and I call upon the leader for the opposition to open the opposition bench. Hear.
And there's three things in this speech. First, what we believe the comparative actually looks like in this debate. Secondly, why we believe that it's so important to have a lingua franca for which oppressed peoples and generally everyone around the world can engage in the same discussions. And thirdly, why we believe that social mobility is going to be far better on our side of the house, and why all of the impacts government wants to have won't actually happen on their side. So firstly, what the comparative actually looks like on their side of the house. So notice that basically every benefit we got from government was the idea that once this motion passed, Oxbridge English would no longer be seen as the absolute standard of what is current best English, and the horrible and like the halls of power will just accept all languages and all the rights of English from all around the world. They cannot just fiat that into existence. They have to explain why people that already believe, like all people and people in power that already believe that their groups are smarter and their English is the correct English, would just suddenly change their mind because the next generation is still something else. We believe that it's actually likely that will not happen. Why is this the case? We believe there are three main reasons. First, we believe, again, these people are already in power. They've already been socialists for a long time. And so in the status quo right now, they're just going to perpetuate the structures of power because that is what they believe is right. Secondly, we tell you the overall majority of popular media, things like Hollywood movies, are still going to be coming from like the US or at worst like the UK or stuff like that. And so you will still have something that people think is correct English in regular discourse, maybe not necessarily in the classroom, but literally everywhere else outside it. But thirdly, notice that the reason why these things have seen as popular and the reason why they're currently seen as standard is because they're the way in which powerful political, economic, and cultural elites already speak, right? We believe that that thing is not going to change on their side of the house. We believe that on their side of the house, there is still going to be a variety of English that is currently Oxbridge English, whatever, in which everybody knows political and cultural elites speaking, and which everybody knows that if you are an elite or if you want to speak to the elite or join the elite, you have to speak. Therefore, we don't see how the benefits actually follow. Also, they have not, okay. What we do also see at the same place is that all of those things regarding culture and identity and stuff like that, we also see that in the status quo, people are perfectly capable of doing things like code switching, right? People are perfectly capable of knowing that they should learn quote unquote proper English for the classroom and still speak in Spanglish with their friends or whatever. Because like, again, most people are relatively smart, especially people that are learning several languages, right? They have the capacity currently of like code switching. Also note something quite important. Also note that actually others are quite marginal, because presumably the people they're talking about, even there's still like some sort of English Spanglish, are presumably still being taught English anyways, rather than just being taught Spanish as they would have otherwise been. Also, they have not explained like the intrinsic value of each specific language, right? Most of Latin America speaks Spanish and is very proud of Spanish, and there is no intrinsic reason why just because Spanish came from Spain, that means that their identities are any less valued or whatever. And so that is the comparison in this debate. First argument, why we believe this creates a lingua franca, and it's actually really incredibly important. So note also one very important thing, right? Note that the reason why we have such sort of prescriptive rules is that the moment in which you have these prescriptive rules, which are universal, is the moment in which you can have a universal language. The moment when I can say something, I can be sure that something from all around the world will more or less try to understand the sort of thing that I'm saying and will more or less understand what I'm saying, right? As the way in which, say, a Black Lives Matter activist can sort of speak with somebody from Hong Kong or somebody else and sort of speak in the same dialect, know that they're not going to be misunderstood, and so on and so forth. We believe that firstly, that's a reason in and of itself why you should try to preserve the lingua franca. Because on the server house, the moment in which English just, or whatever language you're talking about, just breaks up into all those different dialects is the moment in which it becomes harder for people from around the globe to talk to each other. We believe that is a bad thing, but even if you just want to talk about oppressed minorities, it also makes things like international solidarity actually far, far less likely to end up happening. We also tell you this is actually really important because because oftentimes we believe that you have these prestige groups in the West sort of trying to dominate discourse, and that discourse they dominate it in a sort of like standard quote unquote proper English. We believe that the moment in which oppressed people all around the world now are no longer taught proper like quote unquote proper English, are no longer taught how to speak in that specific code, as the moment at which it becomes harder for them to actually interact with people saying things about their own country. We believe a world in which you teach the same standard of English is a world in which like an Indian worker or an Indian trade union leader can actually write an op-ed trying to refute what the New York Times is saying because they are speaking the same language. We believe that's actually a far better world. We believe that if you believe in global discourse and if you want a global society, you necessarily must have a global language which must be universal. Where it's unfortunate that it's called hegemonic language, but we need it if you want to have global discourse and global solidarity. I'll take CD before continuing.
Yeah, this probably doesn't look like saying bonjour, how are you? It probably looks like a bit more like changing the grammar specifically of an English already sentence, which means that people will probably be anyways able to communicate as they already are in those communities we're talking about.
No, that's simply not the case, right? Because grammar is fundamentally how meaning is conveyed. Right? If you change the grammar, you could say the exact same words in a different grammar, in a different way, with different tense, different comma rules and stuff like that, and you're fundamentally changing what you're saying and whether other people can understand it. Clearly, if you speak the same rules, it's easier for you to understand. That's the debate. Secondly, what I believe is also going to lead to better social mobility. Obviously, we regret that is the case, but we believe that if you want to go forward in life, as government tells you, you need to be able to know Oxbridge or proper, whatever, English, right? Why is this the case? Several reasons. First, we believe that just education-wise, right? Especially if you come from a developing country where the education system may not be as good and you want to go somewhere else, you need to be able, first, for people to just think you're smart enough in order to admit you into the university. You need people in the West to believe that you actually speak good English. You need to be able to communicate your ideas with them in a way that is easy for them to be charitable, right? Especially because at this point, we believe that if you have like two exact same admission sets or something like that, and one of them is written in what people currently believe is proper English, maybe if the ideas aren't as polished, people are willing to be charitable towards and are willing to sort of look into it. If the exact same essay comes in what is seen as broken English, we believe people will not be as charitable, and therefore we should give people the tools in order to try to exploit the system and get as far away as they possibly can. Secondly, we also believe regarding things like jobs, for instance, oftentimes hiring managers come from hegemonic groups and they want to be comfortable hiring somebody that they believe can sounds like them and stuff like that. Oftentimes they're public facing roles, but oftentimes it's just the confidence people have, right? Because if I know that I can speak whitey or whatever, then I know I have the confidence to actually apply for the job because I know I can integrate into the workplace. I know I can integrate with the clients and so on. The moment in which I feel there's a completely alien language, a completely different language, is the moment in which I even stop doing things and stop actively trying to do things. Also applies for things like immigration, for instance. We believe that generally it's like they said, oh, you need a TOEFL or whatever to immigrate. Yes, precisely, right? Under their side of the house, people will not be able to immigrate because they will not be able to pass those tests. When they get into those countries, it will be harder for them to integrate. And you sure you might say things like identity, but presumably these immigrants really care about like integrating their children, being like playing with other people, them being hired and so on. Those things become far harder on their side of the house. So ultimately, why should you vote for opposition? Firstly, because they can just magically wish away centuries of prescriptivism, and because they cannot wish away power dynamics and power dialects. And given that is the world we live in, we should try to give oppressed people all the tools in our toolbox in order to help them succeed in their world. They're taking tools away. That is unacceptable.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for the government bench.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think O is probably out of this debate because their entire case is dependent on us just teaching like a very different form of language and almost with like new words, different words, and like that will completely like spark up the entire language as a whole. I don't think that's the debate. I think the debate is basically something like, I am thirsty, which is why I drank water, will probably be accepted to something like, yeah, thirsty, so please drink water or something like that. I think if you look at the Infoslide as well, it talks about grammar and the rules of that language and not about like overlapping the entire language as a whole to a large extent. If that is the most extreme scenario that they're essentially reliant upon, I don't really think they can win this debate because it's contingent on absolutely overlapping the entire language in the very first place. They have to engage on a moderate ground, which I don't think they're doing. That's first. Their second argument is that, and the second stance is that, listen, the world right now is already extremely hierarchical, and this hierarchy will continue to exist, and hence, to a large extent, we need to allow individuals to take advantage to be a part of that hierarchy. But the problem is, like we've told you from PM, that this language structure is already so just inaccessible in the very first place, which means if you don't propose a counterprop, or if you don't give me any solutions as to why things are going to get better, then you're just supporting status quo, which is already filled with barriers for individuals that you talk about to get access to this in the very first place. And that's why I think they're out of the debate. All right, now let's engage to their best case scenario, which is to say that there are individuals already in power, and proper English will still be looked at as a form of elitism. Yes, I agree that right now at this point of time, it is definitely looked at as a form of the most elitist language. But then in the future, how do you cause this paradigm shift in the very first place? Firstly, a lot of, like, if you look at just economics wise, a lot of the best engineers and doctors that come to America come from places like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, and like in India. The problem with this is that these individuals then have to conform to your own language and then come into that country in the very first place, despite them having the skill in these situations. What happens when in these countries you don't teach the Oxford version of English, but you teach your own version of English that is filled with some level of localization, and that doesn't apply the most correct grammar. These individuals, because of their skill set, will probably still be taken in. But the difference here is now they don't have to conform to the majority version of the English language in the very first place. Which is why at that point of time the country has no option but to accept a lot of these individuals in the very first place. That's first. Secondly, schooling systems within this country, within this sort of countries, encourage you to speak in the Oxford version language. So if you're talking about countries like UK, countries like the United States of America, even if you're Hispanic and you're in a school, or even if you're like Indian and you're in that particular school, you'll be forced to speak language or English in their particular way. What changes under our side of the world is that when there are different approaches to that form of language, it means that you can have new politicians, new role models who come out of the school and speak their own version of language in the very first place. Which is why I feel that to a large extent, even if status quo is stagnant as it is at this point of time, changes happen under our world, and we cause those changes to happen. Under their world, that basically never really happens, and the same old entering system keeps on staying the way they are. Now let's go back to accessibility, and let me tell you why our world is just far more accessible. There are a few reasons. Number one is that to a large extent, even if there are individuals within developing countries who can learn the most proper form of language and gain accessibility, the first thing you need to understand is that the ones who then are able to access that form of language or access that form of education are the most privileged within the developing country, are the most privileged within the impoverished country, and they're the only ones who essentially get access to that. How is then our world better? First of all, under our world, there are many more individuals who actually take up the initiative of learning the language in the very first place. Why? Because see, a lot of common level workers in developing countries, they know tools of the trade, which is basically they know as much as possible in terms of to get passed by with life, or just to basically go by. The problem is when they look at test structures, or when they look at grammar, when they look at how a sentence basically has a preposition, has an adjective, has an object, has a subject, all these things makes it seem that English is basically impossible for them, which is why to a large extent they never attempt in learning English in the very first place. How does this change in our world? When we tell them that English doesn't, or language at that point of time, doesn't it necessarily have to be like, defined by rules and grammar and stuff like that, and that you can apply your own technical knowledge and try and just make sure you can communicate. I think it gives these individuals a lot of self-confidence in the very first place. They feel like, okay, the amount of English that I know, it's enough for me to pass by, so I might as well try and learn a bit more of it. So I think under our world, they make it far more accessible. And the comparative from opening opposition then has to be that how in their world this becomes far more accessible in the future, something that they never essentially talked about. But then they say, no, you need this uniform way of language to ensure that you can communicate with protesters across the world and whatnot. I think that argument, once again, is basically reliant upon someone in Hong Kong not understanding broken English from someone in some other part of the world and vice versa. I think that is inherently problematic to a large extent. I mean, if that is true, then I don't think a lot of people who've been reporting the war from Syria would probably get the reports published, or from Libya, they get the reports in the very first place to begin with, because a lot of those things come in the form of broken English as well. So I don't know what that argument is essentially then contingent upon at this point of time. So I think that literally nullifies a lot of the benefits that like harms that they essentially talked about. But how is it better under our world, and how does that accessibility factor in? There are a few ways. Number one, I think the exploitation of individuals as a result of structurized tests is one that basically goes away. Why? The entire point of why the British Council exists and take exams such as IELTS or TOEFL is because there's a demand for it, and is because these countries feel that knowing their language in the most proper manner is the best way to take in these individuals. When the academics within the host countries changes in and of itself, I think the demand for British Council is going to change as well. Because if British Council cannot cater to our own subjects, then there will be no demand in the country. The example of this is how British Council right now in Bangladesh and India has individual subjects such as Bangladesh studies and Indian studies. So the paradigm shift of what is proper English and what proper English you need to get into a particular country changes. But also, this also allows literature to be much more fluid. We gave you examples of why most prominent authors till this day are white, is because they have the ability to write in English, and any other author who wants to get their work published, despite what the quality of work is, because they can't write it in proper English, they need to get it translated. The translated either then bastardizes the story or bastardizes the expression of it. I think in our world, we allow these individuals to be more fluid and express their work and then publish their work on a larger scale, which is why I think our world gives them more accessibility as well and makes literature much more fluid. Thank you.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and I call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the case for the opposition bench and to close out the top half of the debate.
If I can ask for POIs, if you can wave at me a piece of paper on the video and don't look at the chat. And I'm going to do three things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about the comparative and what actually changes on their side of the house. Secondly, about common understanding. Thirdly, about respectability politics. First, let's talk about what actually changes, right? But recognize that the motion is about regarding policies, regarding teaching and use of those languages. The whole paradigm shift that somehow happens on side opening government is absolutely underexplained, absolutely unresponsive to all the things that Raf tells you. What Raf tells you is that by the fact that you're going to suddenly say, we think all kinds of language or all dialects are somewhat equal, doesn't mean that this is going to be something that suddenly shifts and the whole society is going to change their mind about that subject. Ralph gives you 3 reasons as to why this is something that is going to be, that paradigm should occur either not occur at all or occur really, really slowly. Ralph tells you that implicit biases still exist, and specifically exists among adults who are probably not going to suddenly change their mind just because you change the way you're going to be teaching this. Secondly, the fact that popular media like films are not just going to be suddenly replaced by a new set of popular media. So insofar as you're still going to be consuming the like hegemonic version of English or whichever other language, means that you're still probably going to be seeing that outside like slightly superior. Lastly, it tells you like the fact that you have a powerful class of people who are in power and who you listen to and who you associate with like leadership like qualities, means that again, those the way of these people speak is still going to be seen as the one that's hegemonic. Because of that, all that sort of prestige for the Doxbridge sort of English is still going to exist on their side of the house. What changes on the comparative is, will you actually teach that hegemonic language to people, or will you just scrap it out of curricula? We think that's the problem that they needed to actually address. First, like very quickly on the fact that like they say that the languages that like dialects are going to just die out and we need to protect them. Like, notice that this is not how the status quo currently works, and note like they are accusing us of not having a comparative. We just support the status quo. This is what the status quo is. Like, currently languages or like dialects like Spanglish are preserved within like families, within the fact that you have cultural institutions such as like religious institutions, churches, etc. You have like your friends that you from your community you talk that language with because it's probably more comfortable. You have social media in that like dialects that you can still consume. Notice that under the status quo, most minorities are perfectly able to do code switching. They are perfectly able to use both of these languages and like transfer those like local dialects to future generations. It's just genuinely unclear why you're going to be using that culture. So the only thing that changes is what you are actually going to be teaching. Let's talk about like English second language and on what side is easier to learn English. Because like note that they just like somehow posit that this is going to be so much harder to learn. Like one thing, that prescriptive rules are just much easier to learn because they are clear and you can understand, like instead of being presented with 10 different ways you can say a thing, which is quite confusing, you're actually able to follow rules that are clearly set up for you. So for most people, it's actually much easier to grasp. But then they say like teachers are it's easier for teachers to teach the local dialect. Like even if that's true, we think teachers are still like perfectly capable to teach the hegemonic language as well. And even if it's true, like if it's slightly like easier to teach, on our side, the results of teaching the hegemonic languages are so much more useful that we don't think that's actually a trade-off that we should be making. We think they just underestimate the capabilities of people to like learn a language. We think most, like in specifically multicultural countries, like people are very, very able to learn a second language. We don't think that's a thing. Let's talk about the communalities. Like they say, in the POI, and then we are like not like these languages are not going to be like completely we're still going to be able to understand these languages that are just different dialects. Know that like most of Raf's case is fine with just the fact that we are going to be like that these languages might be mutually understandable, but they are different, and you can comprehend that difference between someone speaking in like a less proper English and the proper English. But like also know that like the Infoslide talks specifically about like Spanglish. They gave the example of Bangladeshi English, which can be quite like hard to understand for people who are not familiar with that specific dialect. Also know that at the point at which you stop using you're teaching the hegemonic language, those dialects are going to be drifting apart. So as the time comes, they are going to be becoming less and less mutually understandable. What are the impacts that Raf tells you of this? The first thing, in terms of understanding among people and specifically understanding on the global stage, even if you still can mutually understand these dialects, know that participation in discourse is often contingent on the fact that people respect you and people want to listen to you. If you are able to present like the reports from war or whatever they want you to talk about in the hegemonic language, no thank you, you are much more likely to be actually listened to and actually be taken seriously, whilst on their side of the house, at worst, you're just not going to be understood at all, and at best, you're going to be taken less seriously. We think that's a harm. Second thing, on construction of common identity, know that very often like languages is a way you are able to relate to others and see them as members of your in-group, feel related to them, feel solidarity towards them, because very often that sort of like common identity is narrated through like discourse of constructing the common language. For example, like know that like the existence of like modern standard Arabic enables the construction of like common Arab identity, which will be probably significantly less likely to occur if you have like often mutually like really ununderstandable regional dialects. This is crucial in things like inclusion of immigrant communities, right? Because at the point at which they are able to speak in the same language as you, I am much more likely to see them as admit them in their in-group, feel solidarity towards them, feel like you are someone who belongs in the same group. They are losing it at their side of the house when these people are never being able to be taught the hegemonic language. They are never able to actually like be involved in that in-group. I think that's incredibly problematic. Let's then talk about respectability, because we do regret that that's the case, but on their side of the house, it doesn't change that there will still be preferable hegemonic language. They still have to they still have to conform to it if they want to have any sort of benefits. Like, note that this affects things like job interviews, right? Because you want, like, people in power who will still speak the hegemonic sort of language will want to hire people who look like them. They will want people who will be able to like be respectable in like public facing roles. Again, if you don't have the chance to learn the hegemonic language, you will be less likely to be given that sort of jobs. Their responses are like they will be skilled, so they will have no choice to accept them. Like, no, that is just not the case. Like, very often you just like people are just much more likely to just prefer a candidate who looks more like them, irrespective of skills. That's how discrimination works. Second, on education, right? Like, Raf tells you about admission essays and things like that, but also like on their side, you have significantly less students from abroad to be accepted in the first place, because on our side, you have a clear mechanism to verify they are able to like comprehend classes via those tests that they dislike so much. On their side, when those tests don't exist, you are just much more likely to much less likely to risk admitting international students. That's quite a harm, right? Like, notice that for all those reasons, just when they are taking away a tool for minorities to be able to get involved in the majority culture, we regret that this is something that these minorities have to do, but we think it's really important for them to take it away from them. For all those reasons, very, very proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for their speech. I thank the top half for the top half, and I call upon the member for the government to continue the case for the government bench and to open the closing half of the debate.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Cool. Sorry. 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do 4 things in this speech. The first thing is just delete opening opposition. Then secondly, talk to you about language perception in the future, breaking the deadlock in the opening half. Then talk to you about access to language a bit more structurally, talking about classroom experience and individuals' empowerment within those areas. Lastly, on social mobility a bit more structurally. So on opening opposition, a trivial observation, which I think, like in DLO, I wasn't sure, but in the DLO, it became quite clear that these guys think that we're going to go around teaching everyone very different types of languages, right? Trivially, I think that the question here is not whether or not you're going to teach everyone English. You're going to teach everyone English. The question is how you do that. That is descriptive or prescriptive. The answer to that then, and the only link they have to this analysis, is the extent to which they say, the prescriptive language is easier to teach. No, it isn't. Like, factually untrue. You give us no reasons as to why we should believe that. I will, number one, counter assert that, but number two, also point out that it is very fucking complicated. Like, the English language, insofar as the good language is concerned, is so fucking complicated. I don't even know what the Oxford comma is. I don't know how to use it. I'm not sure why you think even individuals should use that. I'm not sure why it's even useful. I'm not particularly sure why you think that is easier than the comparative, which is, I want to make this very clear, because these guys seem to think that Spanglish or what's it called is something that necessarily means that you go around and you say, I don't know, hello, my name is Maurice. It's very nice to, I don't know, whatever Spanish wording said it there. No, it's not what this looks like. What it looks like is borrowing certain characteristics from the Spanish language and applying them to the English language. So, for example, it's not like people are going to go around and saying, instead of this being a pen, they're going to say, aha, this is a bed. No, that's not what this looks like. Presumably, it looks like saying this is a pen, but potentially adding a certain syntax or a certain, I'm not sure what the word is, but like the end of the word being different and inspired from the Spanish language. That's what it looks like. It doesn't look like blending languages or speaking one language and just going around talking like that. I don't think that would be any useful. I don't think that's something that the CA team would set at this tournament. I think this is a very uncharitable opening opposition. And if you buy that this is what the debate is really having, then they should probably first. But I don't think that is the case. So language perception in the future. And this stems from my trivial observation on how exactly this plays out. I can accept best case scenario from opening opposition that in the short term, you're going to get some type of problem. That is to say that there are going to be some individuals who are going to try and pressure their individual children, for example, to learn the Oxford English. Number one, I would argue, and also that's something I forgot for opening opposition. They say, you can only get social mobility if you speak Oxford English. No. And if that's the message you guys want to go for, you don't solve that in the status quo. There's a bunch of communities and immigrants who can't do Oxford English, and you're basically saying that they can't do social mobility. I'm not sure where this is going. So first thing to note here is that in the short term, maybe some Oxford people will still push their posh perception of language, but understand that in the future, the individual society at the point at which they are exposed to the idea of descriptive language, what that means is that it becomes an even more inclusive language for the people that need it. At the point at which this is done to every school pretty much in the United Kingdom, let's say, I think this creates the need for everyone to try and be playing on that playing field, right? Because that is how people communicate. I think this also has direct incentives, number one, for the children and the people that currently speak posh to turn around, and because of the fact that they're being taught in that specific form of language, to shift from that. Even if they don't, I'm not particularly sure why this is so bad. The reason why is because I have no problem with people being posh as long as they don't push their poshness on me through the things that they own. What does that mean? It means that if these guys want to talk about the media is largely predicated on free market. The free market, if the average individual speaks more of the descriptive, I'm not confused, like our side's language, it is more likely that they're going to go for the even more inclusive language themselves. This is important. The reason why is because then you don't get that elitism being thrown onto people, because the needs of the society, and by extension, the needs that the media corporations, whoever you want to talk about, the elites have to fulfill are changing, which means that if anything, we are the side that actually pushes those individuals to engage more. And if in their home they want to talk about it's high tea time, then sure, they should go ahead and do that, but I couldn't care less. If that's your net harm, then I'm very happy for that when it comes to opening opposition. So crucially, I think that eventually what we prove here to you, and that's very important because it's entirely missing from opening government, is that language perception by this policy in the future changes. But I think this also has massive implications when it comes to social mobility. The reason why is because ultimately right now we get a fundamental problem, which is actually, I think, highlighted by opening opposition, where they say you can only get social mobility when you talk posh, Oxford English or whatever. I think the problem here is that eventually what you do is that you change society's needs, as I said. But what also that means is that your tests, in order to be admitted into a country and get citizenship, get more relaxed, right? Because you can make mistakes, because everyone's being taught on that descriptive language. But number two, I think that it also matters when it comes to the types of jobs individuals get. That is to say, the reason why immigrants have such a hard time getting jobs that require a lot of human interaction, also known as the jobs where you probably make a whole bunch of money most of the time, is the fact that they often make those very big, like, grammatical mistakes. So if I'm an immigrant in the United Kingdom, I will not get a job because it is seen to be a bad look on the company, right? Because I'm seen as a company that is not particularly capable through the language of my workers to the rest of the world, to my clients. At the point at which your clients change the way that they speak, it's even easier for you to get those types of jobs that are currently very inaccessible. So I think that if we're talking about social mobility insofar as getting jobs and being able to get those jobs that you normally can't get because of language, I think we actually solve that as well. So that's also a benefit we get. I'll take CO if they have something. Sad times. Okay. Access to language. This is very important. I think that this debate, no one is going to prove like that the individual is suddenly going to be enlightened and just learn this language very, very quickly. It's probably going to be quicker, but I'm not sure it's going to be something that is mad. I think what it more looks like is the fact that, A, there's no longer a deterrence for you to go to clash because you're afraid that you're going to be shamed for the way that you speak, or because you're afraid that you can't keep up with the English language because of how weird it is, especially because you already know a certain language and you're at a young age. It also has to do with classroom experience, right? Because these guys consider in opening opposition some type of uniformity. That's weird, right? Different schools in the UK, different areas have different types of ways that they speak. The reason why is because they have different conceptions of language. But more than that, I would point out that socioeconomically, the areas that are not as privileged tend to have their own dialect. The reason why is because you often get the worst teachers going there. And in the richer areas, you get the better teachers going there. So I think that crucially, what we also allow is for a more uniform understanding and pushing of that language in a a way that doesn't have to do as much with where you're born, but or your teacher's ability to teach you that because of the fact that they are getting paid a shit ton of money. But it also has to do a lot with the extent to which the teacher themselves feel more comfortable including all of that. But also it's very empowering. You're more likely to push to learn those things because you no longer think that the Oxford comma will be a big deal that will stop your way. On all those grounds, I think we feel the burdens that opening government hasn't, and we beat opening opposition out of ground. So for all those reasons, CG.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and I call upon the member for the opposition to open the case for the closing opposition team.
Sorry, let me grab my timer real quick. Hi, I'm audible. Sorry.
Yeah.
One piece of review that I think takes down OG out of this debate. I think OG's positive impact in this debate relies upon the assumption that there are some sort of inherent cultural value into the mixing of languages. The reason that this does not constitute this round is because the motion dictates that this is about changing education system. Meanwhile, there are other socialization ways that you can learn languages, i.e. interacting with your family, i.e. interacting with your community. So a lot of their impacts about authors who's writing about their experiences are still parallel on both sides of the house. Then, engaging with closing government. I think closing government's case relies upon one big assumption that they don't prove in the round. That is, everybody will be on the same playing field. That the elite students or the white students will suddenly switch to descriptive language rather than prescriptive language as opposed to the status quo. I think the likely situation when you impose those sort of changes is that your average white kid are still going to speak perfect English, right? Because they'll be able to read from CNN, they'll be able to read from New York Times, they'll be able to interact with their white parents so that they can inherit the skills of languages. The comparatives then on their side of the house are immigrant students who will be able to speak broken English because it's no longer being taught in the education system. That's when the harm disproportionately affects minority. I think this also interacts with the minority argument on their side of the house. Then, I also think that those who have social power, i.e. those who are doing editing work, and institutions like Oxford are not going to change their primary source of language. I think it is asserted by opposition simply with the fiat that this is going to change in the long run without proving to me how the incentive structures of the people in the long run will change. Then, there are two things I want to establish in my speech. Firstly is a defensive extension that's going to deal with how teaching prescriptive language is going to be accessible. Second, I'm going to expand a shit ton on the macro level impact about why descriptive language leads to alienation. Firstly, why I think actually teaching prescriptive language is accessible. Three things to note under this. Firstly, and I think a lot of Gov's argument about why prescriptive language cannot be taught is quite tautological. It is the reason that they provided is that the reason that kids cannot learn descriptive language in the status quo because teachers teach them in a descriptive way. That is ignoring the changes that could happen in opposition in which we switch to a different form of education system, right? In which we just force it, like for example, the education system in China, in which you forces kids to memorize grammatical rules, where you forces them to memorize like articles from Oxford, from like whatever Oxford saying. Second, is that kids are generally going to speaking malleable, right? Kids, when they're at a young age, can learn from different languages, they understand different rules. That's because they don't have a pre-existing bias about the world, they don't have a lot of pre-existing perceptions about the world. So on best, it is likely for the kids to learn some grammatical rules as compared to their side of the house. Thirdly, that there's no harm in teaching these kids in the education system. The worst case scenario on our side of the house is that these kids don't learn prescriptive language, which is going to be a small percentage of the kids, but that these kids learn the descriptive language, right? That they learn from their family and they learn from their family members. So our worst case scenario is literally the best case scenario in terms of teaching accessibility of language. The second thing I want to do is I want to outline my extension. I'm then going to do a bit of weighing with opposition. The extension I really want to get through in this round is how language changes the perception you have on a group of people. Why descriptive, the first thing I want to know on this is I think descriptive language creates a sense of alienation that they are them, that the immigrant community are themselves, and the white majority of society are different from them, from the perceptions or optics we gain from different languages. To give credit where it's due, I think DLO mentioned this argument without explaining to me the decision calculus of any sort of alienation. The framing I want to get through from this argument is that this debate happens, the trade-off between prescriptive and descriptive language usually happens in immigrant community. Because there's no incentive for other languages to mix if it was not an immigrant community. Like there's more of an incentive for them to just teach the language directly. Then the mechanism under this is that I think when a moderate voter, white voter, hear an Asian American say stuff like chop chop or release or like referring to police as aster, it is more likely for them to have a psychological bias against them. That is because psychologically we care about those people we associate to. We have a sense of nativeness. The perception that we are two distinct agents with different communication tools, even though we're speaking the same language, and this biases and perpetuates in your decision-making calculus. You're unlikely going to spark discourse with this community, even if your struggles are similar. It also means that it blocks communication. Externally speaking, it is there's a limited desire for these people to interact with the immigrant community, and contact theory that stems from it is now gone because they do not understand the struggle. On the comparative, it is that when both groups can speak the same level of English, that at least offers a platform for communication. And internally, it is also not likely for these groups to reach out because they feel like they have their own sort of language, they are more accumulated to their sort of language, and also it's just kind of hard for you to speak with those people when you have learned the descriptive language, which are pretty distinct in this way. The impact of this argument is that there's going to be less empathy coming from the majority group of the society. There's going to be more apathy and less empathy. The reason behind it is that we care about those people who will associate with. What is unique about language, we will not mention about opening opposition, that language is a unique form of conveying of information. It's a primary source of, it's a primary agent in which information is conveyed. It overcomes other biases, i.e. your skin color, right? Because you'll be able to, because you hear the information first, when you hear that this person speaks a similar language to you, that's when you're more likely to associate with them. We think the likely situation that stems from it is that politicians are now willing to magically help this individual, and that was largely asserted by opening opposition. I think what is more likely going to happen are three things. Firstly, individuals are more likely going to help immigrant community because they communicate with them more and because they spark discourse more than them. Second impact on this is I think there's going to be a genuine reduction of microaggression that stems against immigrant community in general, especially against the second wave of immigrant that give birth to, right? It means that it is more likely for them to understand the struggles from this community. Yes, OG.
Your outcome is hung on the fact that these minorities can properly understand and comprehend the monolithic nature of English that you teach to them. How do you prove that it's accessible to them?
Sure, there are a few ways you can do it. Firstly, English is generally recognized by the international community as literally the easiest language to learn, right? It requires a limited amount of knowledge for you to learn English. Second, even if the first community cannot understand it, the second community, in which the second generation will be able to learn English and will be able to learn like the mainstream English that the individual can have access to, certainly is that under counterfactual world, we necessarily divert more resources and attention onto that. I think my first extension also said, back to my extension, I think it uniquely reduces the amount of microaggressions that is exerted on these minority groups, in which individuals are more likely going to understand them, they're more likely going to have less discrimination, right? We see that these microaggressions are uniquely important because you as a community and you as a minority, your experiences is determined by how the other people perceive you, because you not only interact with people in your own in-groups, when you go on education system, when you go on training, you necessarily have to meet more new people. When other people see you as an outsider, they're going to treat you differently in all epistemic position of these individuals have, right? They're unlikely going to include you into social circles, and inner circles are important for self-actualization and happiness. On the ground of immigrants, we oppose.
I thank that speaker for this speech, and I call upon the government whip to close out the government bench.
Cool. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the most life-changing experience for me in terms of learning English was a 2-week students exchange in Spain when I was in junior high. And I spoke entirely broken language before that exchange, at that exchange, and after that exchange. Because what was the most meaningful part about my learning process was not comprehension, but confidence. And this is very problematic because we are the only one team in this debate that recognizes that the access to language, even the one that you are used to speaking, is not the only one thing. What matters more is the interaction that creates empowerment. That is to say, the whole idea of the opposition bench, that the elites are not going to learn the language of marginalized people, or that the elites are still going to continue speaking in received pronunciation English or whatever, doesn't matter as much because we don't care whether they speak this language, we care about their perceptions towards different dialects and accents of English and other languages that they're going to know and interact with more meaningfully with the authority of the school in the education system. Firstly, why do we take over the opening government, then the opposition bench? When it comes to the opening government, I think that the biggest problem is that there is at least 2 steps missing from their analysis, because they say language is important, we provide more access to language. And we think that it's fair, but it's definitely not enough. It's not enough in 2 regards. First of all, we go over that because we say, even if you provide a lot of access, even if you give lots of local teachers that speaks Bangladeshi English or Spanglish or whatever, that is still not enough to change what is probably the biggest problem for us, which is the biases that are still going to persist. We have the explanation of how we break this deadlock because we say 2 things. First of all, we empower individuals because we simply do not punish for making grammar mistakes. We simply do not punish for saying something in a broken English. And that is incredibly important because it is at that stage when you are extremely young that actually the perception of what is a correct language, what is associated with class, what is associated with elite breaks down. So even if some people are still going to go to private schools, the vast majority of the society is going to go to public schools, which means that they're not going to have this perception that you need to speak proper English that many times, because they're going to be exposed to that, specifically because you are going to have the legitimacy of the school behind this. Note panel that in many cases, even in extremely elite schools such as Westminster SPGS, people still recognize that English is being spoken in a variety of ways. And for instance, they understand the memes with broken English. However, as soon as they go out of these schools, they stop using this language, although they understand it, because in schools they have been taught it's not a proper way of communicating in English. At the point at which teachers tell, you can communicate in it, it's fine, they're not going to have that many biases in the future, which is absolutely crucial because, as I said, it's not comprehension. So it's not about access and, like spreading the different accents and dialects of English to different parts of the world, but rather the biases and breaking them down that are associated with this. The second point as to why we win over the opening government is also that they talk only about the student side, and we have more explanation on how the whole structure of the society changes in terms of, for instance, the incentives of the elites to talk in the language that is much more acceptable, or the whole market, the whole job market in how basically language ceases to be the only one criterion, as it is often right now when speaking broken English is such a bad thing for the image of the company. Going to the opposition. Firstly, on the opening opposition. So the comparative they draw is something that we cannot defend, to be honest, because it is not that there will be no lingua franca, which is currently English, because we will cease to understand it somehow. It is about dialects, accent, stuff that, as I said, people are already very capable of understanding in most cases. It is just that they do not want to, because they think it is something to be ashamed of. It is something that is not going to be useful. So how do we know the word we defend is going to be like teaching Manchester or Scottish accents at English classes for foreigners, rather than 5 different types of English that nobody uses, nobody can comprehend? First of all, because these are the types of accents, dialects or languages that are currently in use. And what is being put in the Infoslide is that the way we are going to teach these languages is based on the current usage of that in the society. So obviously, there needs to be a mass of people to make it sensible. So for instance, I presume that in the UK, you are going to learn, like 15 types of different accents of English, while in Poland, you are not going to learn that many types of accents because you are unlikely to listen to these accents at any point. So probably you are going to adjust it to a given society as well, which means that it is going to be focused on the efficiency of that and the usefulness of that, rather than, like teaching a language that is basically incomprehensible. But second of all, well, it is for some purpose. You will learn the usage of language to the extent it makes sense. You are not going to learn more than it is needed. The conclusion of that is that most people that want to achieve social mobility or go to Oxford will not necessarily resign from learning the correct language. Because note panel that the opposition is strawmanning us when they say we are not going to teach kids RP English. We are, alongside with many other accents. So if the ones that want to go to Oxford or Cambridge, if the entrance exams require that, want to do it, they will obviously still learn the correct language. But the ones who will not be motivated to learn proper accents are probably the ones that, first of all, would struggle with it anyways. But second of all, and more importantly, the difference is that we extend the opportunities for them by not stigmatizing these people, but not ostracizing them in the education system, not punishing them for grammar mistakes that they, for instance, know from their parents, which means that if anything, they have more ability to be socially mobile on our side of the house, because at this crucial stage of their lives, they were not to be ashamed of themselves, and they were not deprived confidence. Lastly, on the closing opposition. The first thing is that obviously they once again strawman us and they say, oh, kids are not going to learn RP language. They will. But second of all, and more importantly, they have never responded to our analysis about the incentives for elites, the exposure to language that many people are going to have, that is crucially going to change how we accept and how we see different accents and dialects of English, French, Polish, or Greek, or whatever. And crucially, what is extremely important is that with the globalized society, the internet, memes, and different ways of communicating, it is increasingly unlikely that you have many people that are sheltered from understanding, say, a specific accent of English. Most people do understand them, and they understand it also because they have friends from different environments, they interact with the internet contact, and so on and so forth. So they have never answered to us as to why this empowerment and the exposure that we will give is not enough for making people access more opportunities in their lives. Very proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and I call upon the opposition whip to close out the opposition bench and the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So first of all, quick rebuttals to causing government. So there are like ideas about like teaching the like, for example, the EFL speakers or speakers in developing nations can get more accessible to teaching and practicing because they won't like feel it's a big deal to make a mistake, for example, in grammar. We think this sort of assertion and this benefits does not exist for two reasons. Like their premise is upon the fact that they assume like it's understandable when we have different forms of language. But Ricky already showed you why this is not the case, because the difference is not just about grammar, but more about like when you have a different social circles, when you have different communities, when you have different cultural backgrounds, and not a lot, like let alone the difference of vocabularies, all those stuff. It's quite hard to bridge the differences and to actually establish the understanding. So that's why the premise upon like causing government based upon does not exist. Second responses to that point is like when you find out, as for example, EFL speaker, that there's so many different forms of languages and terms and phrases like you have to use and understand in chats or online discussion that they cannot actually understand, is even much more intimidating for those speakers in the very first place, because they can't feel relatable, they can't get the context of that discussion, and they don't want to bother asking them all the time, what do you mean by saying that? So we don't think like it's more accessible from the poll side. And secondly, the analysis about like elite has the incentive to change. We don't think that's the case, because like first of all, like we don't actually think like elites can get exposed to so many different standards in the very first place, because basically descriptive policies means like you still get like the rule you believe to be the case is more likely to be the one you get exposed in your daily life, you communicate with the people around you. So for those privileged people, they're more likely to discuss and like live with someone who shared the similar social status with them. So it's very hard to say why exactly suddenly those privileged people can actually like accept the completely different standards of language and think it's also legitimate. And second reason for why that is not true is because we don't think elites have the incentive to change their standards in the very first place, because they also want to maintain their privileged status and want to exclude the people who they disagree with in the very first place. So like then rebuttals engagement with opening government. So we think like let's clarify one thing so we can deal with opening government case. So who will actually be taught and speak in other forms of language? It's definitely not those privileged people who already speak the so-called standard language, but rather those minority groups or immigrations like Ricky already identifies to you. So what's the implication of this clarification? That means, again, that those privileged people are still surrounded by other privileged ones, and they're more likely to get exposed to the so-called standard language, and their role is still the one they believe to be the truth. So we don't see like how all of a sudden they can actually change their perception. And if they can actually accept this difference, we think no matter how, like they will already accept this sort of difference in the status quo. So the burden for OG to prove is why those people who may not like accept the difference of language standards in the status quo can actually more likely change in that particular way. So we think this is the premise of whole OG's case about acceptance and accessibility, and that does not stand. Before I move on, is there any PI from opening government? If no, CG.
Yeah, we are the only team that.
CG.
Oh wait.
Yeah. Wait. Are you speaking? CG.
Okay. We give you reasons as to why, independent of everything big like social mobility and all that, we are the only team that tells you why, on an individual level, individuals are much more likely to be empowered to the extent where they try to get that social mobility, which they are often deterred from doing in the status quo. Please engage.
The problem here is the analysis that individuals can actually get empowered is premised upon the fact that elite class can accept the change of language standard and are willing to accept their entry into the social discourses or the social like mobility. We don't think, I already showed you like why that is not the case, and we don't think the change of elite mentality actually got proven in God's side. So let's move on to closing. Why the contribution coming from closing opposition is the most important one. So two things we show you. The one is very hard to interact with all those different forms of language. It's not just about like teaching that opening opposition premise their case upon, and all the gut teams tries to rebut. Is as we already put to you, it's about culture, it's more nuanced mentality, it's about social circles and all the daily interaction that contributes to the context of language. We think based on this characterization, it's very hard to say why all of a sudden people can actually understand so many different languages that based upon different contexts. So this is actually, this is also the reason why closing opposition's impact is more unique and is more like realistic in comparison with open opposition, who premise that whose case is contingent upon like people do not actually understand or relate so basically open opposition's premise to say people cannot actually understand or relate to other ones because of the teaching, but when God team already challenged that a lot, their premise no longer stands in that sense, and closing opposition fills the gap. So second layer of contribution, we put to you like why the impact is not just marginal, but like it's very influential, that influencing everyone in the society. So when the elite class, their psychological perception has not yet changed, this influence all the daily interaction between the elite class and all those immigrations and all those less privileged people. So Ricky already proves to you that why we have a like implicit psychological judgment upon other people based on the language, this will lead to much less empathy and less understanding of other situation and language and discourses, and also leads to like more aggression and biases towards them. It's not just like open opposition talks about like workplace or something like that, but also like everywhere in online discussion, like in terms of how you review your problems to the society, and how exactly you try to persuade the voters as a politician who want to try to represent the minorities, and whether you can actually achieve that goal. So this sort of like psychological influence is very, very powerful. That actually, it's actually proves that the empowerment claimed by God Bench is not true, and is not likely to occur when we have different forms of language that is hard to appreciate it by the elite class in the very first place. So based on that, very proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for that speech. I thank everyone for what was an excellent debate. Congratulations to all the teams for making it this far, and I think we'll pop into a breakout room to discuss.
one question before you do. Are the results going to be announced straight after that or at the conclusion of the tournament?
Talks. Admin.
We're gonna be announcing at the end of the tournament because they like doing their weird celebration thing where they invite speakers.